On a freezing December morning in 1887, the most powerful man in Pittsburgh came upon a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As steel magnate Cornelius Vandermark walked down the marble staircase of his Fifth Avenue mansion, he found his wife's emerald evening gown spread out neatly on the Persian rug of the grand foyer, still warm as though she had just slipped out of it. But Evangeline Vandermark had vanished. The front door was locked from the inside, every window sealed tight against the brutal Pennsylvania winter, and none of the servants had heard or seen a thing that night. Only 4 hours before 3 of them had watched her go to bed in that very gown. Under political pressure, the police closed the case in 6 days, blaming lack of evidence. But the truth was far more sinister. Her disappearance was the last move in a deadly 2-year game between a daughter seeking justice for her murdered father and a husband whose fortune was built on the ruins of his enemies. To understand that night, you must go back to the winter of 1887, when Pittsburgh's steel barons ruled like kings, and murder was just another tool of business. Pittsburgh then was at the peak of its industrial glory. A city choked with the smoke of mills, where ambition and desperation hung heavy in the gray sky, and immigrants came hoping to forge their dreams in the blazing furnaces. It was a city of sharp contrasts, where palaces stood near filthy tenements, and a man could rise to untold wealth or be ruined and forgotten within months. The Vandermark mansion dominated an entire block, a Gothic fortress with towers and turrets casting long shadows over the Allegheny River, carved gargoyles from France stained glass windows of industrial triumphs, and a ballroom big enough for 300 of the city's elite. 4 acres of gardens, greenhouses, and outbuildings surrounded it, including a carriage house servants' quarters and an ice house whose secrets would later come to light. Cornelius had risen from a steel mill laborer to one of the richest men in America, with innovations that changed the industry. At 52, he was tall with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes, hands softened by wealth but scarred from years in the furnaces. A man whose early hopes of improving workers' lives hardened into ruthless ambition. Competitors had been erased through mysterious accidents, fires, and disappearances in an age when laws could be bought as easily as iron. His marriage in 1882 to Evangeline Hartwell was the event of the decade, a union with a Boston banking family that gave him the respectability and loans he needed to expand. Evangeline, 20 years younger, with copper-colored hair and a bright laugh, fluent in languages and polished in every art, was more than a trophy bride. Beneath the grace and education of New England's old money was a sharp mind and a strong will that would one day stand against her husband's empire. Their marriage secured his power, but it also set in motion a reckoning that 5 years later would begin with a gown on a cold floor and a conspiracy reaching to the very top of Pittsburgh's gilded society. Evangeline entered the marriage believing she was joining her life to a man whose genius could genuinely change the lives of American workers, never realizing that Cornelius Vandermark saw human life as nothing more than a resource to be spent in the relentless pursuit of wealth. By the winter of 1887, those closest to the couple whispered that the grand Fifth Avenue mansion no longer echoed with laughter. Evangeline, once the bright star of Pittsburgh's social world, had become withdrawn and quiet, spending long hours hidden away in the vast mansion library, filling the pages of a leather-bound journal that she kept locked in her writing desk and guarded with a small brass key she wore around her neck. That library was a towering sanctuary of knowledge, its shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, filled with over 3,000 volumes, rare first editions, scientific works, and a growing collection on the history of American industry that Evangeline had assembled herself. The servants noticed her new habits. They saw her leave for long solitary walks at odd hours, often returning with mud on her boots and a faraway look in her eyes. These walks took her into Pittsburgh's rough working-class districts, where she spoke with the wives and children of the mill workers, listening to their stories of danger injuries and the endless toll taken by the furnaces. What the staff could not know was that these conversations were part of an investigation. She had begun piecing together a pattern of industrial accidents and suspicious deaths that seemed to appear wherever her husband's business expanded. The household was staffed by 12 of the most loyal and carefully chosen servants in the city. Margaret Sullivan, the Irish head housekeeper, had run the household with strict precision. For nearly a decade, a woman whose intelligence and moral conviction would make her a key witness to the strange events that unfolded. Thomas Brennan, the Scottish groundskeeper, tended the vast estate with a perfectionist's eye and knew every corner of the property. His knowledge of the land would eventually uncover chilling signs that something far darker had been happening on the grounds. Charles Henley, the butler, trained in the strictest traditions of service, was present for every grand party and intimate family conversation, and even his cultivated discretion would falter as the events surrounding Evangeline's last months became more bizarre. Dr. Franklin Westbrook, the family physician, had been tending to the Vandermarks for 5 years, and in his private notes, found long after he revealed a deepening concern over the toll the marriage was taking on Evangeline's health and spirit. Using careful euphemisms like marital strain to describe what he suspected but dared not speak aloud. For all of them, trained to keep silent and loyal, her disappearance was unthinkable. Life in the mansion followed a strict rhythm as precise as the ticking of a clock. Everyone's movements were known, their duties timed to the minute, leaving no room for strangers to slip in or anyone to leave unnoticed. It was this order so tightly held that made her vanishing seem almost supernatural, as though she had been erased from within. Beyond the gates of the Vandermark estate, the city itself seemed to tense, as if it could sense what was coming. Pittsburgh in 1887 was a powder keg. The echoes of the Haymarket riot in Chicago still haunted the industrial cities of America. And here the workers, tired of danger, starvation, wages, and the ever-present threat of death in the mills, were beginning to organize and demand justice. Beneath this rising unrest, whispers grew of a secret alliance of powerful industrialists, a brotherhood that would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on the engines of America's wealth, even if that meant silencing anyone who dared to stand in their way. And now, Evangeline Vandermark, armed with the truth she had been quietly gathering for months, was about to find herself in their sights. The evening of December 12, 1887, began in the Vandermark mansion with the same clockwork routine that had shaped its life for years. At exactly 7 o'clock, Margaret Sullivan carried dinner into the formal dining room. A lavish Victorian hall, dominated by a mahogany table that could seat 24 guests, its surface glowing beneath a glittering crystal chandelier imported from Bohemia. On the walls hung oil paintings of industrial triumphs commissioned by Cornelius himself, silent reminders of his power. The meal that night was fit for royalty. Roasted pheasant winter vegetables from the greenhouse and a bottle of 1878 Chateau Margaux, a French wine so costly it exceeded a month's wages for a steel worker. Evangeline, however, barely touched a bite. She sat silent, pale and restless, her eyes drifting again and again toward the windows, as if she were waiting for something or someone to appear from the snowy dark beyond. Margaret would later tell Detective Samuel Crawford that the young mistress seemed to be memorizing every detail of the room, as if she knew she might never see it again. Cornelius, on the other hand, was all forced cheer-talking in great detail about a new steel contract with the Pennsylvania Railroad and his plans to push into Ohio and West Virginia. But while he spoke, Charles Henley, the butler, noticed him glancing down at his pocket watch over and over, like a man waiting for something inevitable. By 9:30, Margaret was helping Evangeline prepare for bed, and here the night took a strange turn. Instead of a dressing gown, Evangeline slipped into an emerald silk evening dress, usually reserved for entertaining a shimmering Parisian creation covered in intricate beadwork that caught the gaslight and made her seem almost unearthly. Margaret complimented the dress, and for the first time in weeks, Evangeline smiled a real smile. Then she pulled Margaret close, hugging her tight and whispering, "Thank you for your kindness. You've been like a mother to me these past years." Margaret thought little of it in the moment, but later she understood that those words sounded very much like a goodbye. Around Evangeline's neck that evening hung something else unusual. A silver locket Margaret had never seen before, its surface carved with intricate Celtic knots. When asked about it, Evangeline said only that it held something precious that must never be lost, and she refused to explain further. At 11 o'clock, Thomas Brennan, making his nightly rounds, noticed the light burning in Evangeline's private study. Through the frost on the glass, he could just make out her silhouette bent over her writing desk, her pen moving in quick, urgent strokes. She appeared to be working with desperate focus, nothing like the calm letter writing he had seen before. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. Inside that room, Evangeline was carrying out the final act of a plan she had been building for 2 years. The study had become an archive of secrets. Documents, photographs, letters, and carefully hidden maps marked with red pins. Each one a record of a suspicious accident, a death, a convenient disappearance, all tied to the shadowy network of industrialists who had built their fortunes by eliminating rivals. As dawn approached, she wrote feverishly, knowing this would be her only chance to leave behind the truth. When Margaret arrived the next morning at 6 o'clock, the house was silent. The front door was bolted from the inside. Every window on the ground floor was locked, their catches tight and untouched. Margaret checked each one. Upstairs, the windows were beyond reach, and Thomas confirmed that all the ladders were still in the carriage house, coated in a fresh layer of undisturbed snow. Outside, the snowfall from the night before lay like a flawless white shroud around the mansion. No footprints, no tracks, no sign of intrusion. It was as though the house had been sealed off from the world. But when Margaret stepped into the grand foyer, her blood ran cold. There, on the Persian rug, lay the emerald evening gown, arranged with deliberate care, its fabric still faintly warm. But Evangeline Vandermark had vanished, as if she had been erased from the earth. There, on the Persian rug, arranged with an eerie, deliberate precision, lay Evangeline's emerald gown. When Margaret touched the fabric, it was still faintly warm, as though it had only just been taken off, and the faint scent of Evangeline's lavender perfume lingered in the cold morning air like a ghost that refused to leave. The gown had been laid out with care buttons, intact beadwork untouched, every fold smoothed flat as though someone wanted it to be displayed. Beside it on the marble floor was a single page torn from Evangeline's private journal, with only 4 words written in her unmistakable hand. The truth must survive. Yet the scene revealed other unsettling details. The rug beneath the gown showed faint discoloration, like a spot recently scrubbed with chemicals, and mingled with the lavender in the air was another smell, medicinal, sharp, and strange, like chloroform. Even stranger was the jewelry. Evangeline's diamond and emerald wedding ring, A fortune in gold and stones lay abandoned on the floor. But the simple silver locket Margaret had seen around her neck the night before was gone, taken while far more valuable pieces were left behind. When Cornelius came down, summoned from his bedroom, the servants expected panic. Instead, he stared at the gown for a long time, silent, his expression pale and grim. Margaret would later describe it as the face of a man who had been waiting for this moment, not one caught by surprise. His first actions were just as strange. Rather than calling the police, he ordered Charles to fetch his private secretary, Arthur Peaton, and told Margaret to collect all of Evangeline's journals and papers from her study. An order that felt less like searching for answers and more like removing evidence. By the time Dr. Franklin Westbrook arrived an hour later, Cornelius had locked himself in his office with Peaton. The doctor wasn't asked to examine the room or the gown. He was led straight into that office for a private meeting, emerging half an hour later, looking shaken and refusing to speak about what had been said. Outside the mansion, Thomas Brennan made a chilling discovery. While the fresh snow around the estate showed no footprints, no tracks of anyone leaving or entering near the heavy wooden doors of the old stone ice house, he found a patch of snow covering what appeared to be a dark stain. Beneath the thin crust of frost, the ground was smeared with something that looked very much like blood. Before he could investigate, Cornelius himself appeared ordering Thomas away and declaring the ice house off limits due to structural danger. That single order would be one of many that cast suspicion on the master of the house. The official investigation into Evangeline Vandermark's disappearance lasted only 6 days, a shockingly short time, for a case involving such a prominent family. Detective Samuel Crawford, a veteran of 20 years with a reputation for tenacity and incorruptibility, was assigned to the case. His persistence and refusal to accept easy explanations would soon make him a target. Crawford found his investigation blocked at every turn, with key evidence disappearing, witnesses silenced, and orders coming from above to wrap the case up quickly. In his private notes later recovered after his dismissal from the force, he wrote of forces in Pittsburgh more powerful than the law itself. His interviews with the household revealed disturbing secrets that never appeared in the official report. Margaret admitted that for weeks, Evangeline had been holding secret meetings with unknown men who came after dark, entering through the service door. They were elegantly dressed, educated, and moved like men accustomed to power and danger. Their cold, assessing stares gave Margaret the impression they were calculating every risk in the room. After each visit, Evangeline became more pale and fearful. Retreating deeper into her study, Thomas confirmed a second secret: someone had been visiting the ice house at night. Though the structure had been abandoned for years, he had found fresh tracks leading to its door always disappearing the next day under a new dusting of snow. Built into the hill behind the mansion, the ice house was no simple shed. It was a fortress of stone with 3-foot-thick walls and a system of drains that kept it bone dry, even in summer, a perfect hiding place for secrets that no one was supposed to find. And it was there, near that silent door, that the last visible trace of Evangeline Vandermark seemed to end. Throughout November and early December of 1887, Thomas Brennan had repeatedly noticed fresh footprints in the snow leading to and from the old ice house on the Vandermark estate. They were the prints of a woman's small boots, identical to the kind Evangeline kept in her closet, and they always appeared at night. The pattern was unmistakable. She had been making solitary, regular trips to that abandoned structure, often staying long enough for a faint glow of lantern or candlelight to be seen from the outside. But there was something more ominous. On at least 3 nights, Brennan saw not only Evangeline's delicate tracks, but also the heavier prints of a second figure, a much larger person wearing the thick-soled boots of a laborer. Unlike Evangeline's path, which came directly from the mansion, these second tracks approached from the public road, suggesting a clandestine meeting deep in the night. When Detective Samuel Crawford tried to investigate the ice house, after hearing Brennan's account, Cornelius Vandermark personally blocked him, insisting the structure was unsafe. It was an excuse Crawford found absurd. The ice house had been built into the hillside with the same obsessive craftsmanship that defined the entire estate: 3-foot-thick stone walls, perfect drainage, and a foundation meant to last a century. Even when Crawford pushed for a limited inspection of the exterior, Vandermark's lawyers suddenly intervened, declaring that no access could be granted without a specific court order. By the time Crawford returned 3 days later with the necessary warrant, the ice house had been sealed. Fresh mortar had been used to close its heavy doors and windows so completely that even the hinges were entombed in stone. The speed of the work was astonishing. It would have required a team of masons and a supply of building materials assembled and executed within hours, likely the same night Evangeline disappeared. This blatant obstruction was only the beginning. Crawford quickly learned that Evangeline's private leather-bound journal, the book she had been writing in with feverish determination for months, had vanished. The locked desk in her study, which only she could open, was found intact with no signs of tampering, yet the journal was gone. When questioned, Cornelius denied any knowledge of such a book, though Margaret Sullivan swore she had seen him reading from it on the very morning Evangeline went missing. The missing journal became central to Crawford's investigation because the staff described it as more than a diary. It was a methodical record, a collection of documents, diagrams, and accounts of incidents that appeared to form a dangerous story. Margaret had watched Evangeline fill page after page every night for at least half a year, compiling evidence that connected industrial accidents, unexplained deaths, and hidden financial dealings. Following this lead, Crawford began digging into Evangeline's family history, and what he found widened the scope of the mystery far beyond the walls of the Vandermark mansion. The Hartwell banking dynasty of Boston had collapsed in less than 5 years, a fall from old money prominence to near ruin. Her father, Harrison Hartwell, died in 1886 under circumstances that Boston police called a suicide, though friends and associates swore he had shown no signs of despair. The official file was shockingly thin, a single page noting his death by hanging in his own office with no letter and no explanation. Privately, sources told Crawford that in the weeks before his death, Harrison had been investigating a fraud scheme tied to the steel industry, a conspiracy involving Pittsburgh industrialists who profited by orchestrating accidents that manipulated steel prices and let them seize rivals' assets at bargain prices. After Harrison's death, Evangeline's younger brother Edmund, a newly minted Harvard-trained attorney who had been helping his father, left Boston, suddenly supposedly bound for California. Records, however, told a different story. Edmund purchased a train ticket to Chicago, but there was no evidence that he traveled further west. Hotel logs placed him in Chicago for several months in the winter of 1886 to 1887, using the alias E.I. Harrison, always paying cash and never staying in one place for more than a few days. After that, his trail went cold. As Crawford pieced the fragments together, a pattern began to emerge. The Hartwells were not the only family destroyed in this way. Across New England and the mid-Atlantic, he found evidence of other prominent families ruined by sudden financial collapse, mysterious deaths, or unexplained disappearances. The common thread was always the steel industry. In case after case, the assets of these fallen families had eventually been absorbed by companies linked to a small, tightly knit group of industrial magnates, the same circle that Cornelius Vandermark belonged to. By the end of his initial investigation, Crawford had uncovered the outlines of something chilling. Evangeline's disappearance was not a random act or private domestic tragedy. It was the latest move in a systematic campaign that had lasted over a decade, a campaign in which rival families and inconvenient truth seekers were eliminated through orchestrated accidents, financial ruin, and murder. The evidence pointed toward a secretive organization of industrialists, men who had murdered and conspired their way to control of America's steel empire. And Evangeline, armed with her father's research and her own discoveries, had become their greatest threat. Crawford's investigation revealed that the secretive network he had begun calling the Pittsburgh Circle was far larger and deadlier than even his worst suspicions. His research suggested that over the previous decade, this alliance of steel barons, bankers, and industrialists had been responsible for at least 37 deaths. Business rivals eliminated under the guise of tragic accidents, labor leaders silenced by fires and explosions, reform-minded journalists who disappeared without a trace, and even family members who knew too much. Their methods were varied, but always precise, staged factory accidents. Fires set to look accidental, apparent suicides, and vanishings that left no evidence behind. 3 months after Evangeline's disappearance, Pittsburgh's industrial world was rocked by a catastrophe that at first glance seemed unrelated. At 3:17 a.m. on a bitter March night, a massive explosion ripped through the Consolidated Steelworks owned by Cornelius Vandermark's greatest rival, Henry Rutherford. The blast killed 17 men and obliterated half the factory. Although the official report blamed a faulty boiler, whispers in the city told a different story: sabotage. The pattern of destruction did not match a normal accident. It appeared to have originated at multiple points at once, and investigators found that safety mechanisms had been deliberately disabled in the hours before the explosion. Amid the wreckage, a night watchman named Patrick O'Connell discovered something extraordinary: a partially burned leather satchel hidden beneath the collapsed office building. Inside were pages of documents that described the weaknesses of several Pittsburgh steel mills, detailed engineering diagrams, and most damning plans that looked like schedules for deliberate industrial sabotage. Many of the notes were in a familiar feminine script, the same hand Margaret Sullivan recognized as Evangeline's. The satchel held months, maybe years of careful observation. It contained sketches of factory interiors, floor plans, security routines, and photographs of critical machinery, exactly the information needed to engineer a disaster. O'Connell, unsure of what he had stumbled onto, quietly handed these materials to Detective Crawford. As he sorted through the contents, Crawford's heart sank. The satchel proved that someone with Evangeline's handwriting, and likely Evangeline herself, had been investigating or even orchestrating acts of industrial destruction. Even more chilling were a series of letters inside correspondence between someone signed EV and another person identified only as EH. The letters spoke of a plan to bring justice for father, to expose the Circle's secrets, and to dismantle their empire. The handwriting of EV matched samples of Evangeline's, while the EH letters bore the careful hand of someone trained in law or academia, almost certainly her brother Edmund Hartwell. This single discovery reframed the Consolidated explosion. It was no random act. It was part of a series. In the past 18 months, 7 steel mills, coal mines, and factories in Pennsylvania had been crippled by unexplained fires, machinery malfunctions, and devastating explosions. Each attack targeted either one of Vandermark's major competitors or a company he had sought to absorb. Each incident followed the same pattern it struck during times of financial weakness. Labor unrest or negotiations ensuring that the victims would be forced to sell their holdings cheaply. Crawford's investigation revealed that this was no coincidence. It was a coordinated campaign, a brutal form of economic warfare. The Pittsburgh Circle wasn't just removing individual obstacles. They were systematically remaking the industrial economy of Pennsylvania in their own image, consolidating all power into a shadow government of steel and coal magnates. These men didn't just control factories. They controlled judges, police chiefs, politicians, and the newspapers that shaped public opinion. With their own private army of former soldiers, detectives, and hired killers, they acted with absolute impunity. The deeper Crawford dug, the more personal the case became. He uncovered that Harrison Hartwell, Evangeline's father, had been the first to uncover this conspiracy while investigating suspicious investments on behalf of Boston banking clients. His suicide in 1886 was a staged execution to silence him. Edmund Hartwell, the young attorney who vanished shortly after, had been next on their list, but had managed to disappear, possibly going underground, to continue his father's work. Now it appeared that Evangeline, living inside the very heart of the circle, as Cornelius Vandermark's wife, had taken up their cause. Crawford's search eventually led him 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh to a remote farmhouse purchased by a shell company connected to Vandermark. Hidden behind reinforced shutters and fortified doors, the modest home was a fortress. Inside, the study walls were covered in maps marked with pins, newspaper clippings, genealogies of Pittsburgh's industrial elite, and photographs. A sprawling chart linked names, companies, and deaths, a visual map of corruption that laid bare the circle's rise. There were ledgers documenting how fortunes were made through manipulated markets and coordinated accidents, and there were photographs, some taken secretly, showing meetings where men like Vandermark planned the destruction of their rivals. In the cellar concealed behind a false wall, Crawford discovered a smaller hidden room. Inside were dozens more documents and photographs, proof that the circle's influence extended beyond industry into politics, law, and the press. These files revealed assassinations staged as suicides, journalists silenced by force, and judges who were secretly on the circle's payroll. Among the most damning evidence was a photograph that made Crawford's blood run cold. The boiler room of the Consolidated Steelworks, marked in red ink, with notes in Evangeline's handwriting describing exactly where to place charges for maximum damage. The photograph was dated November 15th, 1887, less than a month before Evangeline's disappearance and months before the March explosion. The implications were devastating. The evidence suggested that Evangeline had not only uncovered the circle's plans, but may have been actively orchestrating their collapse from within, using the same tactics of destruction they had perfected. And for that, she had vanished. Crawford's meticulous study of the papers hidden in the farmhouse's concealed chamber revealed a truth far more complex and infinitely more tragic than anything he had imagined. Evangeline had indeed been tied to the planning of the Consolidated Steelworks explosion, but the documents made clear she was no willing saboteur. She had been forced into it. Among the evidence was a series of personal letters that explained everything the circle had discovered, that her younger brother Edmund was still alive, and they used him as leverage. Every piece of intelligence Evangeline passed to the conspirators was done under threat that Edmund would be killed if she refused. Her marriage to Cornelius had become a gilded cage, and while she was trapped inside it, they made her a pawn in their campaign of destruction. But Evangeline had not been defeated. While appearing to comply, she built a detailed record of everything the circle had done, every fire, every explosion, every death, hiding that evidence in secret caches across the estate and the countryside. The most revealing letters discovered hidden in a hollowed-out book were signed E, confirming that Edmund Hartwell was alive. Through these letters, brother and sister coordinated a desperate plan to bring the conspiracy into the light, while protecting themselves and a handful of allies who still dared to resist. The final letter, dated December 10th, 1887, 2 days before Evangeline vanished, was written in a hurried hand that Crawford later admitted chilled him to the bone. Sars E. Our father's death was not suicide. C knows we have uncovered the truth about the circle. They will come for us within days. I have hidden copies of all evidence in multiple places. If I am taken, remember our childhood hiding place. The truth waits there. Do not trust anyone in Pittsburgh. Their reach extends into government itself. Trust only the Chicago contact I named. Time is running out. V. Attached to the letter was a hand-drawn map of the Vandermark estate marked with the locations of these caches. The largest mark was over the old ice house. In that moment, Crawford realized that Evangeline's nightly trips to that structure had not been meetings. They were acts of courage storing away proof of the circle's crimes. What followed was a race Crawford never got to finish. As he made plans to recover the evidence, he began to notice eyes watching him in the street. Strange men loitering outside his boarding house, and a sudden fear from the servants and workers who had once spoken freely to him. By April 1888, just as he was preparing to return to the ice house with a team, the conspiracy struck. On a rainy morning, Detective Samuel Crawford was found dead in an alley behind Pittsburgh Central Police Station. The official report said heart failure brought on by heavy drinking, but everyone close to him knew better. Crawford barely drank, was in excellent health, and most damning of all, his files on the Vandermark case disappeared from the station that very night. His death sent a message: this case was closed permanently. In the months that followed, Pittsburgh descended into a tense and watchful silence. Steelworkers whispered about mysterious accidents that seemed to target anyone who talked about safety or unions. Journalists suddenly found their editors unwilling to publish stories that cast the steel barons in a negative light. Politicians once sympathetic to labor reform abruptly shifted their positions, preaching economic stability instead. The circle had tightened its grip, but Crawford's work had already spread farther than Pittsburgh. Unbeknownst to the industrial elite, the detective's private letters had reached trusted contacts in other cities. These quiet ripples began to grow. In Boston, Captain William O'Brien reopened the file on Harrison Hartwell's so-called suicide disturbed by evidence of a cover-up. Signs of a struggle in the banker's office, a watchman's account of 3 well-dressed men leaving the building, and the remarkable speed with which the case had been closed. His search for Edmund Hartwell revealed only a trail of aliases, but he began to suspect the young attorney was moving through the Midwest, still investigating. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Tribune journalist Michael Flanagan had been tracing a pattern of accidents that mirrored what Crawford had uncovered in Pittsburgh. His work led him to rumors of industrial cartels in Cleveland, Detroit, and beyond. Through a network of intermediaries, Flanagan finally made contact with himself, Edmund Hartwell, alive and living in the shadows. The meeting changed everything. Edmund confirmed that the circle in Pittsburgh was only one arm of a larger network, a coalition of industrial magnates stretching across the country. These groups shared methods, information, and protection, manipulating accidents and markets to build fortunes, crush rivals, and maintain their absolute control of America's economy. Edmund's life since 1886 had been a fugitive existence. New names, constant movement, no allies except those he could trust with his life. Yet through it all, He had never stopped gathering evidence. Now, with Flanagan's help, he intended to finish what his father had started and what his sister had risked everything to expose. Evangeline's disappearance. Crawford's murder and the silence that followed marked only the opening moves of a much larger battle. Beneath the outward calm of Pittsburgh's soot-stained skyline, a storm was gathering. What Edmund uncovered in his investigation was far worse than even Samuel Crawford had ever imagined. The Pittsburgh Circle, which for years had been whispered about as a cabal of ruthless industrialists, was not an isolated alliance at all. It was a branch of a vast coordinated network that extended its influence into the highest reaches of American power. This shadow network consisted not only of steel magnates and coal barons, but also bankers, railroad tycoons, newspaper publishers, senators, judges, and even cabinet members in Washington. They functioned as an invisible government, shaping the nation's economic and political destiny, while using violence as their ultimate instrument of control. Edmund's evidence revealed that this conspiracy had manipulated entire eras of American history to serve their purposes. The financial panic of 1873, long remembered as a natural market collapse, was in fact orchestrated, timed precisely to devastate vulnerable businesses so the conspirators could scoop up assets for a fraction of their value. They engineered strikes and provoked violent clashes between labor and management, creating chaos that justified federal troops being sent to crush workers' organizations. They influenced tariffs and treaties, ensuring their industrial empires grew, while American families paid the price. But the most devastating truth Edmund revealed to journalist Michael Flanagan concerned Evangeline herself. She had not simply vanished into the Pittsburgh night. She had been murdered on December 12, 1887 by Cornelius Vandermark with the assistance of other Circle members. When Evangeline threatened to expose everything they had done to federal authorities, the Circle decided she had to be silenced permanently. Yet, before her death, she hid extensive evidence in multiple secret caches and insurance policy to ensure the conspiracy would one day be exposed, even if both she and Edmund were eliminated. The evidence she compiled was extraordinary photographs of hidden meetings, copies of confidential letters, transcriptions of conversations captured using one of the new Edison phonographs, and ledgers that traced money flowing through shell companies into sabotage and assassination plots. Most importantly, she documented names dozens of victims and potential witnesses who might be willing to come forward if they could be protected. During their tense meeting in an abandoned warehouse on the south side of Chicago, Edmund revealed that he and his sister had devised a bold plan to destroy the Pittsburgh Circle, a simultaneous release of their evidence to law enforcement newspapers and honest politicians in multiple cities. They hoped that by releasing it everywhere at once, the Circle would be unable to suppress it or eliminate all those involved. But before they could act, Cornelius discovered her secret investigation. The confrontation in her study on December 12th was brutal, ending with Evangeline's murder and the destruction of much of the evidence she had gathered. Edmund recounted the last message he received from her, a coded telegram sent only hours before her death, warning him that their plan had been compromised and urging him to implement their emergency contingency. He arrived too late to save her and was forced to choose between a doomed rescue and preserving the evidence that could one day bring justice. As Edmund told Flanagan this, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, followed by the metallic click of revolvers being drawn. The Circle's agents had found them. In those last seconds before the door burst open, Edmund pressed a leather portfolio into Flanagan's hands, whispering that it contained maps of all Evangeline's hidden caches and the names of other witnesses. Then, as the men forced their way inside, The two fled into the dark, dodging gunfire and escaping only because of their intimate knowledge of Chicago's alleys and the help of workers who had every reason to hate the circle. That narrow escape changed everything. Both men knew that they were now hunted. Edmund realized that no matter how many identities he assumed, the circle's network was wide enough to eventually find him. For Flanagan, the portfolio was both a key and a curse. It contained the secrets that could topple one of the most dangerous criminal empires in American history or end his life if he failed. And so the story returned to that terrible winter night in 1887 to 11:47 p.m. when Cornelius Vandermark entered Evangeline's study without warning. She looked up from her desk, where she had been recording the last of her findings, and saw the man she had married standing in the doorway. His face was a mask of cold fury, and for the first time, she understood that the moment she had long feared had finally come. The discovery behind the library wall in 1921 finally revealed the complete, unbroken truth of what had happened in the Vandermark mansion on the night of December 12, 1887. The red leather journal found in the sealed chamber served as a first-hand account of Evangeline's final hours, and the surrounding shelves, lined with documents, photographs, and evidence, provided the proof she had died gathering. As the journal described, Cornelius had confronted her just before midnight, accompanied by two other members of the Pittsburgh Circle men she knew well from polite society. They came not as guests, but as executioners. Cornelius had in his hands copies of the photographs she had risked everything to take, the letters she had exchanged with Edmund, and a cold, emotionless expression that told her deception had been exposed. His words, calm, deliberate, venomous, made it clear there would be no mercy. "Did you really think I wouldn't discover your little investigation?" Evangeline had spent months preparing for this moment. Every page she wrote, every document she collected, had been placed in hidden caches with the knowledge that she might not live to see them used. She had believed that her plan to fake her disappearance, to vanish into the hidden servant passages of the mansion and buy time for Edmund to spread the truth, would be her salvation. The emerald gown laid in the foyer was her final illusion, a deliberate symbol left behind to confound the household and make her escape seem like a ghost story. But she had underestimated them. The passages she trusted to protect her had been built under Cornelius's direction. He knew them as well as he knew the layout of his own desk. They had her cornered before she even reached the panel door. The last pages of her journal captured the dread of that realization. The heavy footsteps outside the study, the low murmur of voices she recognized, and the cold certainty that the game she had been playing was over. What happened after that final entry was never written in her hand. But the evidence in the chamber told the rest. She had hidden everything she could in those last moments, sealing the compartment behind the library wall before attempting to flee. She never made it out. Her murder, long concealed behind layers of wealth and influence, was carried out that night, her body hidden so well that for over 30 years it remained only a whispered rumor. The archive itself, uncovered by accident during renovations in 1921, was damning beyond belief. Over 200 documents lay preserved in the chamber, including financial ledgers, maps, photographs, coded letters, and her own journals. Together, they exposed the Pittsburgh Circle for what it was: a shadow empire built on murder and the manipulation of an entire economy. They revealed how industrial accidents had been staged, how stocks were manipulated, and how the deaths of rivals were covered with bribes, fear, and false investigations. Photographs taken in secret at the Vandermark mansion showed faces that Pittsburgh society had once celebrated. Steel barons, railroad magnates, bankers, judges, senators. In these images, they sat together planning fires and explosions, deciding who among their rivals would be accidentally removed from the playing field. The financial records were even more damning, detailing precisely how they profited from these disasters, short-selling stocks before a competitor's mill exploded, buying assets from widows and bankrupt partners for a fraction of their worth. Letters from Circle members revealed their influence extended far beyond Pennsylvania into Washington itself. And finally, there was the journal entry dated December 12, 1887, the last words Evangeline ever wrote. It told of her confrontation with Cornelius, her accusation that he had murdered her father and destroyed her family for power, her belief that she could still appeal to some vestige of conscience. Instead, Cornelius mocked her, admitting that their marriage had been nothing but a weapon, and that now, because she had chosen to oppose him, she had become a liability. He gave her a false choice: disappear forever under a new identity, or die like the rest. Her final act of defiance was to refuse him, to ensure her evidence was hidden, to let Edmund and those who came after carry on her fight. And so she did not run. The last line in her journal, its ink smeared by what might have been tears, ended mid-sentence, the writing broken and trembling. After that, there was only silence. For 34 years, the room remained sealed, holding its secrets, while the Pittsburgh Circle continued to prosper. Cornelius Vandermark died in 1903, lauded as a titan of industry, never punished for what he had done. But with the discovery of the hidden chamber in 1921, the truth he had tried so hard to bury finally began to crawl back into the light. When the workers pried open the false wall in the Vandermark mansion in 1921, they expected dust, perhaps a forgotten storage space. What they found instead was a hidden room that told a story the city of Pittsburgh had tried to forget. The chamber was small, lined with shelves, and a single desk, a refuge built for secrecy. On those shelves lay hundreds of documents and photographs, but in the far corner, buried beneath rotting curtains and collapsed wood, they found bones, the skeletal remains of a woman dressed in the tattered remnants of an emerald silk gown. A single silver locket still hung around her neck. Inside was a small photograph of Harrison Hartwell, her father, and an inscription carved with delicate precision. "To my beloved daughter Evangeline, may you always fight for justice, no matter the cost, Father." 1882. That locket confirmed what no one wanted to admit. These were the remains of Evangeline Vandermark. The medical examiner's report, though limited after 34 years, revealed the terrible truth. She had not died quietly. The skull bore evidence of a crushing blow, and the bones of her arms showed fractures consistent with defensive wounds. The scratches carved into the walls and gouged into the wooden floor proved something even more chilling. She had been sealed alive in the chamber. Her final hours were spent in total darkness, clawing at the bricks, desperately trying to escape. And yet, even in her final moments, she left a message carved with a piece of broken jewelry. "Edmund," the circle continues, "stop them. Justice for father," of 1887. That final plea, scratched into the floor, became the rallying cry of the federal investigation that followed. The evidence in the chamber was overwhelming. It documented the conspiracy in painstaking detail, financial records proving that members of the Pittsburgh Circle had profited from orchestrated industrial disasters, letters between powerful men planning accidents and market manipulation, photographs secretly taken by Evangeline of gatherings where industrialists, bankers, and politicians plotted sabotage. There was no room for denial. The scandal erupted across the country. Attorney General Harry Dogie ordered a federal task force to seize the materials before they could be destroyed. Local Pittsburgh authorities, long compromised by bribes and threats, were pushed aside as federal agents descended on the city. The investigation revealed the staggering scale of the crimes. For over 3 decades, the Pittsburgh Circle had orchestrated the deaths of at least 93 people. Rivals, whistleblowers, journalists, reformers, even family members, using methods that ranged from staged accidents and suspicious fires to subtle poisonings and open assassination disguised as street violence. Their influence reached into the very top of American society. Senators, judges, railroad tycoons, newspaper barons, and even members of presidential cabinets were implicated. It became clear that Pittsburgh was not unique. There were similar circles in New York, Cleveland, Chicago, and Detroit, linked in a vast decentralized network that shaped the entire course of American industrial expansion. The federal agents tracked down Edmund Hartwell, now living as Edward Harrison in Los Angeles after decades of exile. He confirmed everything. His testimony revealed how he and Evangeline had spent years gathering evidence, constantly hunted, forced to change names and cities, watching their allies die one by one. She knew that night was a trap, Edmund told investigators, his voice breaking. But she believed that the truth would outlive her. She believed someone someday would open that wall. And she was right. The rediscovery of her archive became one of the largest federal prosecutions in American history. Dozens of the most powerful men in the country were implicated. Some died before trial. Others went to prison. The legacy of the Pittsburgh Circle was shattered, but at an unimaginable cost. The investigation also revealed what had long been suspected about Detective Samuel Crawford. Internal documents confirmed that Crawford had been murdered in 1888, his death staged as a drunken collapse, and all his evidence stolen that same night, a warning to anyone else who might dare to pursue the truth. By 1921, the city of Pittsburgh was forced to confront the truth about the world its steel empire had been built upon a hidden war of greed, power, and murder. And at the center of it all stood the name of one woman, Evangeline Vandermark, who fought until her last breath to ensure the truth would survive her. The final chapter of the Vandermark mystery reveals just how deep the rot had spread. Crawford, as later uncovered by federal investigators, had been assassinated by operatives of the Pittsburgh Circle. Poison was slipped into his food or drink, a substance so precise it induced the appearance of a natural heart failure, leaving no marks and no immediate suspicion of foul play. His sudden heart attack conveniently silenced the only man who had come close to unraveling the conspiracy, and the disappearance of his case files that same night ensured there would be no trail for honest detectives to follow. What the Circle did not anticipate was Crawford's widow. Despite repeated threats from unknown men demanding that she destroy his private notes, she hid them away. When those notes surfaced during a federal corruption probe years later, they revealed that Crawford had been far closer to exposing the Circle's full scope than anyone had realized. They named names, described methods, and hinted at evidence caches that had never been retrieved. The subsequent investigation, spurred on by those notes, uncovered something extraordinary. The Circle's influence reached into the highest corridors of American power. Senators, congressmen, federal judges, all were implicated as beneficiaries, enablers, or full participants. It was the largest corruption scandal in the nation's history up to that time. Dozens of resignations and removals followed. In the years that followed, the world of the Pittsburgh Circle began to dissolve, at least on the surface. By the early 1920s, the Vandermark mansion was demolished under the official excuse of structural failure. But the timing was suspicious. It came just as investigators were beginning to catalog evidence hidden in the property. The site was converted into a park with a modest memorial honoring unnamed victims of Pittsburgh's early industrial violence. There was no mention of Evangeline or the Circle, a quiet erasure orchestrated by the families that still controlled the city. Vandermark's empire was quietly broken apart, its assets scattered across trusts and front companies, and yet the families involved retained vast wealth, remade their reputations through philanthropy, and hid their origins behind a veneer of legitimate business. The exposure of the Circle forced sweeping change. New federal safety laws, protections for unions, and oversight of industrial practices transformed the steel industry. These reforms came far too late for the hundreds who had died in accidents that were anything but accidental. But they made it far harder for such conspiracies to continue in secret. Investigative journalism also changed forever. Reporters adopted more sophisticated techniques for protecting sources and following money. And federal investigators gained new powers to pursue organized cross-state criminal enterprises. Though Evangeline's body was never found, her legacy endured. Her hidden evidence and her relentless effort to document the truth gave reformers and journalists the ammunition they needed to dismantle the Pittsburgh Circle's dominance. She had uncovered the conspiracy that killed her father and destroyed her family, and chose to stand inside the very heart of danger rather than run from it. In doing so, she became a symbol of extraordinary courage, a woman in a time when the system was designed to silence her, using her own vulnerability as a weapon to strike back. The story of Evangeline Vandermark shows how power can twist even the closest relationships, turning a marriage into a trap. But it also shows how determination can outlive violence. Decades after that frigid December night in 1887, the truth she risked everything to preserve helped bring justice to the dead and change the course of American industrial law. And yet, even with the Circle's secrets dragged into the light, one question lingers like a shadow over history. Was everything really revealed? Or do some of their secrets still lie buried in hidden ledgers, sealed rooms, and private archives? Could similar organizations, modern, global, armed with technology, still be operating today, reshaping industries while silencing anyone who stands in their way? What do you think? Could a 21st century Pittsburgh Circle already exist in boardrooms and digital networks, unseen and untouchable? If you found this story chilling, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with those who love tales where the lines between history and horror blur. The past may be buried, but as Evangeline's story proves, it is never truly gone.